It was perfect, I say out loud. To no one. Elegant, secure, and exactly what I wanted. Then they showed up. I stood back, admiring my newly installed driveway gate. It was wrought iron, a classic design, with graceful curves and subtle embellishments. It was automated, of course, with a keypad and remote control. It provided a sense of security, a touch of privacy, and, I thought, a definite upgrade to the curb appeal of my home in Regal Ridge Estates. A name, I often thought, that was far more aspirational than reality. I, Richard Hamilton, am a practical man. I appreciate the finer things in life, but I'm not one for unnecessary extravagance. I like things to be functional, aesthetically pleasing, and above all, my choice. I'd moved to Regal Ridge Estates for the supposed peace and quiet, the allegedly well-maintained landscaping, and the debatably convenient location. I hadn't, however, signed up for the tyranny of the homeowners association. The gate, I thought, was a perfect compromise. It wasn't some gaudy, over-the-top monstrosity. It was tasteful. It blended in with the somewhat upscale aesthetic of the neighborhood. It was inoffensive, or so I thought. My moment of gate-admiring bliss was interrupted by the arrival of a small, beige sedan, which pulled up to my driveway with an air of official disapproval. Out stepped a man who looked like he'd been born wearing a tie and carrying a clipboard. He was thin, pale, with a perpetually pinched expression and a name tag that read, Mr. Fuss Budget, HOA Compliance Officer. "Mr. Hamilton?" he asked, his voice as dry and lifeless as his name suggested. "That's me," I said, already bracing myself for the inevitable. "Mr. Fuss Budget," he said, extending a hand that felt suspiciously like a ruler. "From the Regal Ridge Estates Homeowners Association, we've received a report about your gate." "A report?" I repeated, feigning surprise. "What kind of report?" "A report of non-compliance, Mr. Hamilton," Mr. Fuss Budget said, his voice tightening slightly. "Your gate. It's not in keeping with the architectural guidelines of Regal Ridge Estates." "Not in keeping?" I asked, looking at my gate, then back at Mr. Fuss Budget. "It's a wrought iron gate. It's black. It's gate-like." "It's too ornate, Mr. Hamilton," Mr. Fuss Budget said, emphasizing the word as if it were a personal insult. "The scrolls, the finials, the design." He shuddered slightly. "It's excessive." "Excessive?" I repeated, my voice laced with sarcasm. "It's a gate, Mr. Fuss Budget. It's meant to keep people out, not to win a design award." I gestured to some of the other houses on the street. "Have you seen some of the gates around here? There's one down the road that looks like it belongs on a medieval castle, and another one that's bright pink." "Those gates," Mr. Fuss Budget said, his voice stiff, "were approved. Prior to installation, your gate was not." He fails to mention why they were approved. "I submitted the plans," I said. "I followed the procedure." "The plans," Mr. Fuss Budget said, tapping his clipboard, "were insufficiently detailed. They did not adequately convey the ornateness of the final product." It was clear that this wasn't going to be a rational conversation. Mr. Fuss Budget was a drone, a rule follower, a man who probably measured his grass with a micrometer. He handed me a violation notice, informed me that I had 30 days to remedy the situation, and retreated to his beige sedan, leaving me standing there, fuming, in front of my perfectly lovely, and now apparently illegal, gate. The HOA meeting, held in the Regal Ridge Estates Community Clubhouse, a building that looked like a McMansion that had lost a fight with a stucco factory, was, as expected, an exercise in bureaucratic frustration. The board members sat at a long, imposing table, looking down on the assembled homeowners like a panel of judges on a particularly dull reality show. And then there was Eleanor Vanderbilt. the president of the Regal Ridge Estates HOA, and the self-appointed queen of all things tasteful, which in her world seemed to mean beige and bland. She was an older woman, dressed in a classic suit that looked like it had been purchased sometime in the Reagan administration. She had a perfectly coiffed and suspiciously immobile hairstyle, a permanent air of disapproval, and a voice that could cut glass. She was, in short, the living embodiment of everything I disliked about HOAs. "Mr. Hamilton," Eleanor began, her voice dripping with condescension, "your gate has been brought to our attention." "My gate, Miss Vanderbilt," I corrected, trying to maintain a semblance of civility, "is a perfectly functional, aesthetically pleasing addition to my property. It provides security, privacy, and, I believe, enhances the overall appearance of my home." "It's too imposing, Mr. Hamilton," Eleanor declared, her voice rising in pitch. "It's not harmonious with the neighborhood's aesthetic. It sets a dangerous precedent." "A dangerous precedent?" I repeated, incredulous. "It's a gate, Eleanor. It's not a nuclear missile silo." "It's a security risk," she continued, ignoring my comment. "It blocks the view of the street. It makes it difficult for emergency vehicles to access your property." This was, of course, complete nonsense. The gate was fully automated and had a Knox box for emergency access. "It's designed to enhance security, Miss Vanderbilt," I countered, "and frankly, I find it far more aesthetically pleasing than some of the other architectural choices in this community." I subtly gestured towards a nearby house that was painted a particularly garish shade of purple. A few nervous titters rippled through the room. Eleanor's face turned a shade of red that clashed violently with her classic suit. "Mr. Hamilton," she said, her voice dangerously low, "are you familiar with the architectural guidelines of Regal Ridge Estates?" "Intimately," I said, "and I don't see anything in there that specifically prohibits my gate's design. There are guidelines for height, for materials, for setbacks, but nothing about ornateness." "The guidelines are open to interpretation, Mr. Hamilton," Eleanor said with a smug smile. "And my interpretation is that your gate is unacceptable." The other board members, a collection of mostly middle-aged men and women who looked like they'd rather be anywhere else, nodded along in agreement. They were clearly Eleanor's puppets, afraid to challenge her authority. Except for one, a younger man with a slightly amused expression. I suspected he might be a closet rebel. "The gate," Eleanor declared, slamming her gavel down with unnecessary force, "must be removed or significantly altered. You have 2 weeks, Mr. Hamilton, and you are hereby fined $500 for violating the architectural guidelines of Regal Ridge Estates." $500. For a gate? It was absurd. It was outrageous. It was war. I walked out of that meeting, my blood boiling, my sense of injustice reaching critical mass. Eleanor Vanderbilt had declared war on my gate, and I, Richard Hamilton, was not about to back down. 2 weeks. That's all the time Eleanor Vanderbilt, in her infinite, classic-suited wisdom, had given me to remove or significantly alter my perfectly lovely, perfectly functional, and, in my opinion, perfectly tasteful wrought iron gate. 2 weeks to dismantle something I'd paid good money for, something that enhanced the security and privacy of my home, all because it was deemed too ornate by the self-proclaimed arbiters of Regal Ridge Estates aesthetics. 2 weeks to absolutely, positively not comply. I, Richard Hamilton, was not a remover of gates. I was a defender of gates, a champion of entryway enhancements, and I was not about to let Eleanor and her band of beige-loving bureaucrats dictate what I could and couldn't have at the entrance to my own driveway. It wasn't just about the gate anymore. It was about principle, It was about freedom of expression, within reasonable limits, of course. It was about, well, it was mostly about getting back at Eleanor Vanderbilt. My internal monologue was a delightful mix of outrage, amusement, and steely determination. "Too ornate, is it?" I muttered to myself, pacing my living room. "I'll show them ornate. I'll show them imposing. I'll show them something they'll never forget." I needed a plan, a strategy, a way to fight back, to defend my gate-related rights, to make Eleanor Vanderbilt's head explode. And to do that, I needed to use their own rules against them. My first stop, naturally, was the internet. And Google. I began researching. HOA lawsuits, property rights, architectural guidelines, and because why not, medieval castle architecture. The more I researched, the more a plan started to formulate. The Regal Ridge Estates HOA bylaws. My constant companion, my source of both frustration and, increasingly, inspiration. I'd read them before, of course, but now I was poring over them with the intensity of a scholar deciphering ancient scrolls. I was looking for weaknesses, for ambiguities, for loopholes large enough to drive a large, expensive SUV through. I also started looking around the neighborhood, really looking. And I was finding a lot. There was the house with the shutters that were definitely not an approved color, the garden with the bird bath that was at least 6 inches too tall, and the biggest violation, a massive RV parked on the side of the road. It was against so many rules, and had been there for months. I also found something better. It was hidden, buried deep within a section on exterior modifications and enhancements. There were the usual restrictions on fences and gates, the usual demands for harmony and conformity. But then, there it was, a vague, almost carelessly worded exception. Historically inspired architectural features, it stated, and entryway enhancements of a significant nature may be permitted, subject to review by the Architectural Committee. Historically inspired? I muttered, a slow smile spreading across my face. Entryway enhancements of a significant nature. The wording was so wonderfully ambiguous, so open to interpretation. It was a loophole big enough to build a castle through. The idea, when it struck me, was so audacious, so over the top, so utterly ridiculous that I almost dismissed it. Almost. But the more I thought about it, the more I loved it. I wouldn't just replace my gate, I'd replace it with a castle entrance. A massive, imposing, historically inaccurate castle entrance. I envisioned 2 stone, or more likely, concrete, towers flanking my driveway, complete with battlements and fake arrow slits. A fake portcullis, made of heavy wood and metal that could be raised and lowered, for dramatic effect, of course, and a drawbridge, probably just a ramp, that extended over a dry moat. It would be a glorious, absurd, utterly unforgettable spectacle, and I would argue, with a perfectly straight face, that it was a historically inspired architectural feature, an entryway enhancement of a significant nature, and therefore perfectly compliant with the HOA bylaws. I could already picture Eleanor's reaction, her face turning purple, her classic suit practically bursting at the seams, her carefully constructed world of beige conformity crumbling around her. The plan was perfect. It was insane. It was expensive. But it was also undeniably brilliant. Operation Castlegate was a go, and Eleanor Vanderbilt was about to learn that messing with a man's driveway gate was a very, very bad idea. I wanted it to fit in the neighborhood, just to be larger. My first call was to a local contractor, a man named Frank. Apparently, I attract contractors named Bob and Frank, who specialized in custom stonework. "So, let me get this straight," Frank said after I'd explained my vision and shown him my very rough sketches. "You want a castle entrance at the end of your driveway, in a suburban neighborhood?" "Exactly. I said, nodding enthusiastically. Think medieval fortress meets modern convenience, with a touch of absurdity. Frank stared at me for a moment, then burst out laughing. You're kidding, right? Dead serious, I said. I have a situation with my HOA, and this is my solution. I briefly recounted the saga of the gate, the fine Eleanor Vanderbilt, and my burning desire for a little bit of medieval-themed revenge. Mr. Hamilton, Frank said, wiping a tear from his eye, you are my kind of client. I'm in. This is going to be the most epic driveway gate ever built. But, and I can't believe I am asking this, how authentic are we going for? Authentically inauthentic, I said. I want it to look impressive, imposing, even a little intimidating, but I also want it to be, obviously, not a real castle. Think Hollywood medieval, think theme park castle, think so over the top it's hilarious. I also want it to fit. We discussed the details. The size, large, but within the vaguely defined limits of the entryway enhancement clause. The materials, a concrete facade, made to look like stone with some real stone accents. The features, towers, battlements, a fake portcullis, a drawbridge ramp, and maybe even some hidden speakers to play medieval music. And so, construction began. The first step was, of course, the removal of my perfectly lovely, and now officially banned, wrought iron gate. I watched with a mixture of sadness and satisfaction as the workers dismantled it, piece by piece. It was the end of an era, but also the beginning of something much, much grander. Then came the heavy equipment. Trucks arrived, carrying tons of concrete, steel, and faux stone. The noise was deafening, the dust was pervasive, and the spectacle was magnificent. My quiet suburban street was transformed into a medieval construction site. The neighbors, as expected, were intrigued. They gathered on their lawns, staring at the growing structure, their expressions a mixture of shock, amusement, disbelief, and the inevitable question, what on earth is he doing? I, of course, played the part of the eccentric homeowner perfectly. I'd stroll out to the construction site, wearing a hard hat, for dramatic effect, and a pair of work gloves, and offer vague yet enthusiastic explanations. It's a historical recreation, I'd say, with a perfectly straight face, an entryway enhancement, a tribute to medieval architecture. The construction process was a whirlwind of activity. The concrete foundation was poured, the towers began to rise, the fake stone facade was meticulously applied. It was like watching a time-lapse video of a castle being built, except instead of taking centuries, it was taking weeks. My internal monologue was a constant stream of triumphant pronouncements and giddy anticipation. "Take that, Eleanor Vanderbilt," I'd mutter to myself as another section of the wall went up. "Enjoy your harmonious aesthetic now." I could practically taste her impending outrage, and it tasted like sweet, sweet victory. There was, of course, a brief visit from an HOA representative. Not Eleanor, thankfully. She was probably still recovering from the shock of seeing construction crews at my house. "Mr. Hamilton?" he said, looking nervously at the towering structure. "We've received some concerns about this project." "Concerns?" I repeated, feigning innocence. "What kind of concerns?" "Well," he said, stammering slightly, "it's rather large and unusual. It's a historically inspired architectural feature," I corrected with a perfectly straight face. "And, as you can see," I added, pulling out a copy of my building permits and the relevant HOA bylaws, both of which I now carried with me at all times. "It's perfectly compliant, all permits approved, all regulations followed." He looked at the documents, then at the castle entrance, then back at me. He clearly had no idea what to do. He mumbled something about reviewing the situation and retreated, looking utterly defeated. I, Richard Hamilton, had once again outsmarted the HOA, and my castle entrance, my monument to parking spot protection and HOA defiance, was nearing completion. The anticipation was almost unbearable. The completion of Castle Keep, as I'd christened my magnificent creation, was a moment I'd been eagerly anticipating. And, as expected, Eleanor Vanderbilt's arrival was prompt. She didn't even bother with the pretense of a casual drive-by. She screeched to a halt in front of my house, leapt out of her car, a perfectly sensible, perfectly beige sedan, and stormed towards my castle entrance, her face a mask of apoplectic fury. "What?" she bellowed, her voice echoing through the previously peaceful neighborhood. "Have you done?" I emerged from behind one of the towers, a picture of calm composure, wearing a slightly ridiculous velvet robe I'd purchased specifically for the occasion. "Good afternoon, Eleanor," I said, my voice smooth and even. "You're admiring my entryway enhancement, I presume?" "Entryway enhancement?" she shrieked, pointing a trembling finger at the towering structure. This is unbelievable. It's a castle. You've turned your driveway into a medieval fortress. It's a historically inspired architectural feature, Eleanor, I corrected with a perfectly straight face. Perfectly compliant with the HOA bylaws, I might add. Section on entryway enhancements of a significant nature. Remember? Significant nature? She sputtered, her eyes bulging. It's preposterous. It's ludicrous. It's completely out of place. I call it Castle Keep, I said with a shrug, and I think it adds a certain je ne sais quoi to the neighborhood, a touch of whimsy, a dash of historical inaccuracy. You built this thing just to spite me, she accused, her voice shaking with rage. I built it to protect my parking spot, Eleanor, I said, my voice dripping with mock innocence. And to enhance the architectural diversity of Regal Ridge Estates. Besides, I added, gesturing towards the fake portcullis, it has some wonderful features. See? I pressed a button on a hidden remote control, and the fake portcullis, made of heavy wood and reinforced with metal for dramatic effect, slowly, majestically began to descend with a satisfying creak and clunk. And, of course, I continued, gesturing towards the drawbridge, which was actually just a sturdy ramp, cleverly disguised with some faux stone facing. We have this, for easy access, and for keeping out unwanted guests. I gave her a pointed look. Eleanor stared at the castle entrance, her mouth agape, her eyes wide with disbelief. She looked like she was about to spontaneously combust. I'll have this thing torn down, she finally managed to choke out, her voice hoarse. I'll sue you. You'll do nothing, Eleanor, I said, my voice firm, because I've followed the rules, your rules. And now, if you'll excuse me, I have to go. Polish my battlements. I turned and walked back towards Castle Keep, leaving Eleanor sputtering in impotent rage on my, now historically enhanced, driveway. The emergency HOA meeting, part 2, because apparently one epic meltdown wasn't enough, was, if possible, even more chaotic than the first. Eleanor, looking like she'd aged 20 years in the past few weeks, presented her case with the fervor of a medieval inquisitor. This castle, she declared, her voice shaking with emotion, is an affront to everything Regal Ridge Estate stands for. It's a safety hazard. It's an eyesore. It's attracting tourists. This last part was actually true. People had started driving by just to take pictures of my castle entrance. She'd even brought in a medieval architecture expert, a guy who looked suspiciously like her nephew, wearing a chainmail coif that was clearly too small for his head. This expert proceeded to drone on about the historical inaccuracies of my design, pointing out that the towers were the wrong shape, the battlements were the wrong size, and the portcullis was, well, fake. Then it was my turn. "Miss Vanderbilt," I began, addressing the board with a calm, reasonable demeanor that was, of course, completely fake, "seems to be under the impression that I've erected this structure solely to annoy her. While I admit that is a delightful side effect, my primary motivation was to enhance my entryway and provide a unique architectural feature for the community." I then presented my defense. I cited the bylaws again. I presented my building permits, all properly obtained and displayed. I argued that my castle entrance was a unique entryway enhancement that added character to the neighborhood, a statement that was met with a mixture of laughter and groans. And, just for good measure, I'd brought along my own expert, a local historian, Dr. Armitage, who, thankfully, had a sense of humor, who testified about the historical inspiration behind my design, praising its creative interpretation of medieval architecture and its unintentional comedic brilliance. While Mr. Hamilton's castle is certainly not accurate, Dr. Armitage said, with a twinkle in his eye, it does capture the spirit of medieval fortifications in a highly exaggerated way. The other board members were, to put it mildly, divided. Some were clearly still loyal to Eleanor, but their support was waning. Others looked confused, overwhelmed by the sheer absurdity of the situation, and a few, I suspected, were secretly admiring my audacity, and perhaps even planning their own entryway enhancements. Then a woman from the back of the room stood up. She was an architect, a resident of Regal Ridge Estates I'd spoken to briefly during the construction. "I have to say," she said, her voice calm and professional, "while Mr. Hamilton's castle is certainly unconventional, it's also quite well built, and, dare I say it, it's kind of fun. It's certainly more interesting than most of the houses in this neighborhood." That was the final blow. The board, facing a potential lawsuit, a public relations nightmare, and the growing realization that Eleanor had completely lost it, voted to table the discussion, pending further review. The meeting ended in chaos, with Eleanor screaming about historical blasphemy and architectural atrocities, and me, Richard Hamilton, the castle-building rebel, walking out with a smug, but well-deserved, I thought, smile on my face. But Eleanor, like a particularly persistent and well-dressed cockroach, wasn't about to give up. What followed was a period of escalating absurdity that I can only describe as the Castle War. Eleanor, obsessed with getting rid of my castle entrance, tried every tactic she could think of. She filed complaints with the city, claiming it was a zoning violation, a safety hazard, and a public nuisance. The city inspectors came, they inspected, and they found nothing. My castle was perfectly legal. She tried to organize a neighborhood petition to have it removed. She went door to door, armed with her clipboard and her architectural integrity speech, trying to convince people that my castle was a threat to their property values and their way of life. The petition failed miserably. Most people either politely declined to sign or slammed the door in her face. Some even added to my castle, leaving small offerings of toy knights, plastic dragons, and even a miniature catapult, which I promptly displayed on one of the towers. She even, I suspect, attempted some minor acts of vandalism. I found a few scratches on the faux stone facade, easily repaired, and a suspicious-looking pile of birdseed near the base of one of the towers. Apparently, she was hoping to attract a flock of castle-defacing pigeons. Of course, I had security cameras everywhere, capturing her every move. And I, of course, responded in kind. Not with vandalism, oh no. I was above that. I responded with enhancements. I added flags to the towers, emblazoned with my family crest, a hastily designed image of a crossed-out parking space and a defiant-looking wrought-iron gate. I installed torches, electric, of course, on the towers, creating a dramatic and slightly unsettling nighttime illumination. I even created a coat of arms for my castle, featuring a fake portcullis, and the motto, Domus Mea, Regule Meae, my house, my rules. And I started to add music to the madness. I had a system installed to play medieval music, and because I couldn't resist, I hosted a medieval times-themed party at my castle entrance. I invited all the neighbors, except Eleanor, naturally, put up decorations, suits of armor, banners, and even a cardboard dragon, and served refreshments, including dragon wings, actually just chicken wings, and mead, actually just apple cider. The local news showed up, filming a segment about the ongoing feud between a homeowner and his HOA, and the castle that's dividing a neighborhood. It was a glorious, ridiculous, utterly over-the-top spectacle. And with each passing day, with each new escalation, I could feel Eleanor's frustration growing, her power waning, her sanity slipping. The castle entrance had become more than just a parking spot protector. It was a symbol of defiance, a testament to the power of creative and slightly unhinged resistance. And I, Richard Hamilton, the accidental medieval lord, was winning.